So last time we talked about Augustine's Confessions and just a bit about who he was and how he got to Christianity, because he was originally a pagan or of one stripe or another, and how he converted. And today we're going to get into his work more. Now, what I have up there is a reminder of one of the themes that Arnhart develops, is that Augustine is a political realist, and maybe the first political realist. It may come as kind of a surprise if you've learned of realism through the intro course and through Machiavelli. What does Augustine have in common with somebody like Machiavelli, right? Because Machiavelli, if anything, is a little bit blasphemous. He doesn't really seem to take religion terribly seriously. And we know that Augustine definitely does take religion seriously, and the last thing that he would want to be is blasphemous. And yet, they both can be categorized as realists. And I think I mentioned last time the kernel, the reason why Augustine is a realist, if he is because of this belief in original sin, in the way that he views human nature. Okay, it's much the same as the way Machiavelli views human nature and how it plays out in this world. Doesn't mean that he approves of it. Doesn't mean that he thinks that we have to totally accept it. Okay, Machiavelli is more of an accepting sort. He says, this is the way human beings are. They're kind of corrupt by nature. They tend to want power. They're self-interested. They do bad things. So we have to accept that, and we have to build our political philosophy around it. Augustine says, well, human beings are bad because of original sin, because of the fall from grace. And if we are to be better in any real way, we have to actually convert. We have to actually receive God's grace, because we can't improve on our own. So Augustine, unlike Machiavelli, always holds out this hope that people will convert, that people will be changed. And once they are saved by God's grace, then they are capable of being much better. Doesn't mean that sinfulness goes away or that temptation ceases, but they're capable of being much better. However, because of his view of human nature, he believes that most of the time, as far as how people should be governed, that they're incapable of really doing better than having a strong, capable government. You hope that at least people are governed by law and order, and that the laws have, sufficient backing to keep them in line. And this is also why he's considered a political realist. When it comes to government, he's pretty realistic about it, about his expectations of it. Okay? I wanted to read one little spot in Arnhart's book, just to kind of explain the connection he's making here. It's in the section, Was Augustine the First Political Realist? And down at the bottom of that page 66, he says, in recent centuries, we have seen the dangers of both excessive idealism and excessive realism. Idealists have seduced us with visions of a cooperative world community forever free of war and injustice. And what would that be, by the way? What's he talking about? Communism. Yeah. I mean, utopia, yes. But, how it played out in the real world in those communist regimes, okay? So, yet in some cases, these utopian dreams may have created opportunities for unprecedented violence and oppression, okay? So he's observing that, these regimes, these communist regimes, were born of utopian ideas, okay? And if people could actually live out those ideas perfectly, they might work. But the problem was, when we tried to implement those ideas in real life, the nature of human beings was not up to that level of perfection. And so instead, consistently, they took advantage of the situation. They took advantage of the vulnerability that they had created to wield power over people, okay? So the utopian dreams turned into oppression. Realists, he says, on the other hand, have seemed to legitimate crude tyrannies, both of the left and the right, by affirming that politics is nothing more than the pursuit and exercise of power, okay? So that would be the mistake of basically sanctioning any type of government as long as it provides order, right, without regard for whether it is doing anything to help people become better, right? And so he says we've made both of these mistakes. We've been overly utopian, which leads to basically a power vacuum, and people take advantage of that. Or we have tended towards just saying, you know, oppressive government at least keeps people in line, okay? And more or less approving or sanctioning that. And that doesn't seem sufficient either, okay? Because it also doesn't take into account that aspect of human nature which is improvable, okay? So he says, this is Arnhart, he says, we hope that political philosophers such as Augustine can help us to understand this modern dilemma. And this is where he places Augustine as a realist, but as a realist who wants to have the best government possible, who kind of fills that in-between role of not leaning towards utopianism, but not also sanctioning just tyrannical government as the solution. Okay? And this is the injection of Christianity into political philosophy here. And there's more than one way to do that. Obviously, some Christian philosophers were utopian, but Augustine is not. So Augustine, as a realist, thinks that sinful nature cannot be overcome, okay? So it takes advantage rather than sticking to the true plan. That's why we can't live in those utopian worlds, okay? Because our sinful nature takes advantage and won't follow through. Our reason is too weak. The great philosophers, like in more modern times, Karl Marx, you know, had this view that human beings could follow his argument and that they could implement a communist regime that would, in his view, fit human nature the best, okay? And that people would continue to cooperate, all right? Which, you know, Marx said was part of the grand historical unfolding. But from the perspective of somebody like Augustine or Arnhart or just about anybody else who doesn't think that way, it has to do with, can human beings stick to a plan? Can they really adhere to reason? I know we're rational creatures, but can we be consistently rational? Okay? And the realist says no. Actually, reason is not nearly as strong as somebody like Marx or a utopian Enlightenment thinker wants to believe. And Arnhart points out that Augustine actually tries to argue why it is that reason is not strong enough. And one of the things that he does point out, and remember, Augustine went through philosophy to get to his Christian conversion. So he did a lot of this himself, seeking the truth, seeking what makes people happy, what do people really want, okay? And Augustine, in The City of God, quotes Marcus Varro, a Roman philosopher who tried to compile all of these various philosophical arguments about what would make people happy, what's the best life, okay? And Varro compiled 288 different answers, okay? And Augustine points this out, okay? Now, this isn't in your selection. This is elsewhere in The City of God. But what do you think Augustine makes of this, that there are 288 different answers to the question of what makes people happy? Is that very comforting? Does that make philosophy look good? Isn't that interesting? Okay, he very quickly kind of waxed philosophy down. He spent most of his young adult life studying philosophy, seeking the truth through philosophy, and believing that philosophy, the use of human reason, was vastly superior to religion. And when he first got attracted to religion, it was because some people were capable of conveying religion through philosophy. Okay? But then he hit a point where apparently he realized philosophy is weaker than religion. Okay? And so by saying this, he seems to be saying, look, in philosophy there's so much confusion, and all these centuries, of philosophizing have yielded 288 different answers to this very basic fundamental question of what makes people happy. So is philosophy really the path to happiness? Is it really the path to truth? Isn't that interesting? Okay, it's a very fast and rather blunt statement about the value of philosophy as opposed to faith in his view. And from the outside looking in, it looks like Augustine's given up. He's given up on philosophy. Okay, and he's just thrown up his hands and said, "I don't know." Okay, but Augustine thinks that the faith is a surer foundation for certainty. Okay, so this is part of his argument against the strength of philosophy. It doesn't mean that he totally throws philosophy out, but now philosophy is subordinate to faith. Okay, and that's the way it continues to be throughout as we go into the Middle Ages with these Christian philosophers. Philosophy is still on board, but it's subordinate to faith. And it's for this reason. Okay, this is one of the main reasons. Okay, so the idea in the City of God is that Christianity is more reasonable because of that than the life of pure philosophizing. Isn't that interesting? It fits people better, he says. It answers the question simply. It takes into account all of human nature instead of this one part, reason, that the philosophers want to focus on. But there's the rest of the human soul. Even Plato recognizes the soul has three parts, right? So, philosophy focuses on that one part, whereas religion focuses on the whole, which in his view makes it more reasonable in a way, more applicable to the human condition. Okay? So, again, from his view, this is realistic. Okay? If we totally embrace reason for finding solutions, we become unrealistic in his view. We become overly hopeful. We become utopian in our view of what we can accomplish in this life through human reason. Okay? And from the Christian perspective, of course, that's arrogance. That's the sin of pride, to think that you can solve all of your problems on your own. Okay? This also is not from your readings, but I just wanted to point out a couple of other things he does in the City of God. He points out that life throws people's way all kinds of problems and miseries that human reason cannot seem to do anything about and cannot answer. Okay, this is from, Book 9, Chapter 4. Okay, but anyway, he says, what flow of eloquence is sufficient to set forth the miseries of human life? Cicero did the best he could in his Consolatio de Morte Filiae. I guess that amounts to the consolation for mortal men or something close to that. But how little was this the best, his very best? As for the primary satisfactions of our nature, when or where or how they come to be so securely possessed in this life that they are not subject to the ups and downs of fortune, there is no pain of body driving out pleasure that may not befall the wise man, no anxiety that may not banish calm. A man's physical integrity is ended by the amputation or crippling of any of his limbs. His beauty is spoiled by deformity, his health by sickness, his vigor by weariness, his agility by torpor and sluggishness. In other words, no matter how wise you are, you're just as likely to be in the way of some calamity as anybody else. Wisdom doesn't protect people from misfortune. Okay. For some reason, I have in mind that basketball player. Not a philosopher, but I know just I mean, at the top of his game, probably, oh my God, it is. It's painful even to think about. And suddenly, all of a sudden, everything comes to a crashing halt for his career. And he'd probably never be quite the same again, although they're trying to be hopeful and saying that he will. But life does this to us, right? I mean, we go out into the world every day, and hopefully we get back home, safe. But every once in a while, something happens, right? The other day I was driving down Claflin. I don't even know what happened to this day because I couldn't find out from the local news, but there was a car on its side in the intersection before it got to Claflin. If it had been on Claflin, I'd think it got T-boned and it went up on its side. But it was on its side in the intersection going into Claflin, and there wasn't another car there that looked like it hit it. And I thought, wonder what happened there, And, maybe that person got out of bed in the morning, thought it was a great day, but something happened along the way that changed everything. And that is the way life is. And what Augustine is pointing out is that it's futile not to study philosophy. That's not futile in and of itself, but to think that through our reason, through our intelligence, that we can prevent these things that happen to everybody, okay? Or that through our intelligence and our philosophy, we can find a way to think good thoughts about these things, okay? To accept them somehow is just vain, okay? Because in the end, through reason, they make no sense at all. Now, part of the question becomes, do they make sense through his framework? Okay, and he tries quite a bit in your readings to prove that, yes, they do. They make more sense. Calamities that you cannot avoid make more sense in his framework than they do in the philosophic framework. In the philosophic framework, what ends up happening is existentialism. We get to the point where, the philosophers say these calamities happen and they're absurd. There is no meaning to life, because they happen to everybody. They seem to be random. And it just proves that there's no meaning in life. Okay, so here we have Augustine basically grappling with the same problem that they do. Okay, and he's saying philosophy can't give us any answers here. It can't give us any consolation. All right. Of the Stoics, which were a group of philosophers, Greek and Roman philosophers, who believed that our response to terrible things, to the horrible things that can happen in our life, as well as the great pleasures and happiness, our response needs to be one of fortitude and sort of detachment. The Stoics said that was the only way that we could be happy, was if we really didn't care about either misfortunes or good fortune and held ourselves back and we're simply strong, So Augustine tackles the Stoics by saying, look now at the great virtue called fortitude. Is not its very function to bear patiently with misfortune, overwhelming evidence that human life is beset with unhappiness, however wise a man may be? It is beyond my comprehension how the Stoics can boldly argue that such ills are not really ills. Meanwhile, allowing that if a philosopher should be tried by them beyond his obligation or duty to bear, he may have no choice but to take the easy way out by committing suicide. So stultifying is the Stoic pride that at all evidence to the contrary, these men still pretend to find the ultimate good in this life and to hold that they are themselves the source of their own happiness. And that really is what they sought. In other words, I'm going to try to find a way to be happy, to be content, regardless of what happens, by stepping back and detaching myself from it and finding my happiness within myself. Okay? Their kind of sage, an astonishingly silly sage indeed, may go deaf, dumb, and blind, may be crippled, racked with pain, visited with every imaginable affliction, driven at last to take his own life, yet have the colossal impertinence to call such an existence the happy life. Happy life indeed, which employs death's aid to end it. If such a life is happy, then I say, live it. Why pretend that evils are not evils when they are not only overcome the virtue of fortitude and force, force it to yield to evil, but make a man so irrational as to call one and the same life both happy and unlivable. He's picking up on some of the Stoics' writings that say you always have the choice, because you have ultimate control over your life, to take your life if you don't want to live it anymore. But basically he's saying, if this is the best that philosophy can do, is to say have fortitude and detach yourself from life and try to just more or less tough it out, this he denies is happiness. He says you can tell yourself it is, you can try to live that way, but the reality is you're not very happy, because the things that happen in this world really do impact us. We're physical beings. So when we get a disease, or we're handicapped, or we become old, we cannot just wish that away. We feel those things. Likewise, if some great thing happens to us, we win the lottery, we find our perfect mate or whatever, we can't be detached from that either. That's part of our lives. We experience that in a way that we can fight it, but we can't ultimately win that battle. Okay? So that leads to what he does in the first part of the selections that you guys have. Okay, I started here because, actually I used Arnhart as a guide, but I like what we see in the first part here, because it does get to the heart of the problem at his time. Okay, in 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome. Okay, and it was one of the attacks that ultimately led to the crumbling of the Roman Empire. Okay. But the more immediate impact was of destruction, of murder, rape, okay? And so, as I reminded you before, Augustine, as a defender of Christianity, was put on the spot, okay, as people became angry and asked, well, why? Why is this happening to us? We've converted to Christianity. We're a Christian nation now, and many of the people who are murdered or raped were Christians. Okay, so how could God allow this to happen? Is Christianity not the path to happiness? Okay, so he sort of takes a look at this from, I guess, a long perspective, and this is basic problem here. It's the same problem that Plato dealt with, actually. Okay? And that is that it seems like sometimes good people are rewarded, but not consistently. Bad things happen to good people too. Okay? And likewise, it seems like sometimes evil people are punished in this lifetime, but other times they're rewarded. They get away with it. Okay? And of course, Plato tried to answer this by saying, you find happiness through philosophy by finding out what justice truly is. Okay? And once you know that, you will be a good person. And even if bad things happen to you, your happiness comes from knowing that you're a good person. Okay? And here we have Augustine saying that's not good enough. That doesn't really work in real life. He just says, it can't really work. If terrible things continue to happen to you, you're going to succumb. You're not going to be able to hang on to this notion that everything's okay anyway because you're a good person. Okay? There needs to be a better answer to that question. Okay? Now, his answer is also, I think, troubling for a lot of people, because it has to do with God and God's role in all of this. Okay? But first he says, here's his first answer. Okay? He has several answers as to why these things happen. Why did the sack of Rome happen? Why does suffering happen? Okay? On the first page of your readings, he says down at the bottom, for if every sin were now visited with manifest punishments, nothing would seem to be reserved for the final judgment. On the other hand, if no sin received now a plainly divine punishment, it would be concluded that there is no divine providence at all. And so of the good things of this life, if God did not, by a very visible liberality, confer these on some of those persons who asked for them, we we would say that these good things were not at his disposal. And if he gave them to all who sought them, we should suppose that there were such were the only rewards for his service. And such a service would make us not godly, but greedy and rather covetous. So he's thinking through, okay, very carefully, why would God reward some people and not others, despite the fact that they're equally good? Why would God allow some people to feel the consequences of their evil, but others not? Okay? And basically, he seems to be saying here, if some people weren't punished for their bad behavior, people would conclude God doesn't exist at all. Okay? If some people were not rewarded for their good behavior, then people would conclude God doesn't really care. But on the other hand, if everybody was rewarded for good behavior, they would come to see the earthly reward as the main thing and wouldn't want to be good for the sake of goodness or for the sake of God. Okay? And if all evil was punished, as he says later on too, we would have actually no free will. That's another argument he gives. Okay? If God set up the framework and became our governor, more or less, punishing evil and always and rewarding good, that would be too much intervention to allow us our own choice. Okay? So, what do you think of his initial answer to that question? He's really trying to figure out, why would God set things up this way? Is it a good answer? Does it make sense?
I think it's a good answer maybe for the day, like the people that were arguing against him too, because I doubt those people would have been satisfied with an answer that's like, it just doesn't make sense, just trust God, and I think he's just trying to reason and help them to, I don't know if it's 100% true or that it would be true in this case, but I think it's like a good answer for the people he's talking to. Like, yeah, I don't know.
Well, at least gives people some notion that there could be a purpose behind these things, right? On the other hand, we can't leave it there, and he doesn't leave it there, because there is a problem with this. I mean, we've talked about free will. He doesn't actually mention that here, but he does go into it later on in the book, which is good because it does help explain, if God exists, why people are allowed to make choices that lead to hurting other people and so forth. But here we see a sort of contradiction. Okay? On the one hand, God is in charge, and he punishes evil sometimes and rewards good sometimes, but not others, for his own purposes. Okay? But as far as the lesson that people could learn from that, it could be, it doesn't matter what I do. Okay? I could be good, and it's like a crapshoot. Maybe I'll be rewarded, maybe I won't, or I could do bad, maybe I'll get away with it. So this isn't good enough. Okay? But Augustine is struggling pretty mightily here to figure out, God's purpose. And maybe he trips over his own restrictions that human beings can't fully understand. He does remind us that all the time, right? That, God's ways are higher than humans, and we can't fully understand such a being and his purposes. Okay? So he does give other reasons in these first few chapters that you have. Okay, let's just look at some of them. He talks about, he seems to dwell on the rape of Christian women, okay, that happened during this attack. Okay, it most troubles the women as well as their husbands and their brothers and their fathers. Why these pious women, who went to church, who prayed to God, could be so mistreated. All right? And he also deals with other issues as well, but that kind of crystallizes for him the problem. How could these women be treated in this way? Okay? And here are some of the speculations. Okay? And I'm going to say they're speculations because there's so many of them that pop up, and these probably aren't all of them. I tried to kind of distill some of the answers that he gives. he says we can never know for sure. None of us have lived a perfect life. None of us are morally perfect. We can't be. Christians as well as non-Christians are sinful by nature. And so it may be that these events that have happened are punishment for our sinful ways. That's a possibility. Now he also then says, but what about, there's going to be some people who may have either lived a very good life, okay, and have sinned very little, and have been forgiven by God for their sins, okay, but yet perhaps if these things happen to them, it's to tamp down their pride, because he actually points out that some people become prideful of their moral goodness. And they begin to think that they are above others because of their chastity or because of their adherence to God's will. Okay? So maybe it's a correction for their pride. If it's not that, perhaps it's to protect them against future pride, because at some point in life they may become prideful. But by an event such as this happening to them, okay, they look back and they think, I'm a part of the human race as well. Bad things have happened to me. I get the sense that some of you are having trouble with the rationale here. Okay? Does anybody want to comment? I mean, what is it that bothers? I mean, you seem to be bothered by it. What bothers you about it?
I know it's like a different time, so I'm trying to look past that. Now it's 21st century, we have a new view on rape and with women.
Yeah.
Instead of back then where, sometimes when it was rape, it was her fault. So I'm trying to separate that from this, and I see how he's looking at it as, well, it's more of, just trying to show, for women to, learn, to not be so prideful and stuff like that. But, I don't know, maybe because he is a man, he doesn't understand maybe how rape has affected these women. Because I feel that in his writings were they're just sad that they got raped. And I think it was more than that for them.
Yeah.
Because it's more of a patriarchal system. It's not really viewed as big of a deal.
That might be part of it. But, I mean, in a way, it could also be kind of an excuse here, that we use to kind of try to explain away how somebody can make this argument. Because he does, he dwells on it. This is like the biggest outrage. This is the worst thing, that happened. And he expresses the incongruity of it, that these are good people. They seem to be pious, believing Christians, and yet this happened to them. He calls it an outrage. And I think that we want to find some sort of excuse, because it seems so difficult for us to imagine that such terrible things could happen because God wants to remind women or men, or both, of their humility and cure them of pride. It doesn't have to be an acceptable argument to you, and it is a pretty troubling argument, actually. And I think that probably the patriarchal part of it, the fact that men viewed women a little differently back then, is probably not enough to fully explain the difference between your opinion and his opinion. I think that Augustine tries very, very, very hard to figure out a reason for everything. Okay? He really kind of seems obsessive about finding a reason. He so wants to answer this question that people have. How could this happen to me? Why didn't God protect me? That, in effect, he may go overboard in trying to strain for explanations. Okay? It makes more sense maybe to say, stick to the free will argument, okay, in which, these bad people made bad choices, but because they could do so because they have free will, right? And everybody suffers as a result of that, as a result of original sin and so forth. But when trying to find more specific answers, okay, why did this happen to me? Well, is there any sin in your past? Is there this? Is there that? I think you would have the same sort of arguments to level at men, I guess is another way to say what I'm saying. He does include the murders and the beatings and all of these other things that happen to men, and he's got the same answers, okay? They happen because, maybe they happen because of this, this, and this. We're trying to figure out God's reasons, okay? So there's a little bit of the philosopher still here in that he tries so very hard when really it's probably not possible to find out those reasons. Yeah.
Reading this kind of made me feel like he was having his own little Christian crusade going on in his head about the reality and the Christian faith and what it means to people. It just felt like in his head and in his writing, he was having his own little crusade going on in his mind. And going off of Michelle's argument with women and rape and all that stuff, it kind of also made me think about that. What justifies when the Crusades came around, when they were raping and pillaging, and they were doing it in the name of Christianity. How does this play into those reasoning? It just kind of made me think about all of that together.
Yeah.
What all of that meant and what that meant to be. Is that still being a good Christian, or is that?
Yeah, I doubt if Augustine would approve of any of that. I mean, based on the Crusades happened after Augustine, but based on what he says about what good Christian leadership would be like, he would not ever justify Christians going and raping and pillaging, and that would be a deviation from.
That's what made me think, wow, if he was there during that time.
Yeah. I don't think he would justify it. I really don't, based on what he says. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, I feel like he would have condemned all those actions, like the murder, anything. Yeah, he would have said that was wrong. But he also, I think Calvin took from Augustine a lot. I think what he's trying to do is he believes that God has control of everything. It's
Yes.
I think he's trying to so since if I punch someone in this class, if God allowed it or allowed it to happen, so it had to be there for a reason.
Right.
And so I think that's his problem. It's not that he condones punching someone or condones murder. He's just I think he's I don't know, inside, but he's trying
That's
to figure
exactly
out.
it. God, in his worldview, God controls everything, which is why Winston's example is troubling, because even though I think if you did put Augustine into that situation, he'd say, no way, God doesn't want you to do that. But at the same time, since he thinks that God controls everything, it's problematic. Does that mean that when Christian soldiers did rape people, that was sanctioned by God after all? I mean, it is. I think he gets himself into this difficulty by arguing at times that God's intentions are in everything that is done.
Yeah, because I also agree with Winston, because it seems like you were saying before that maybe Augustine should have stuck more to the free will. Because I think when he tries to give a reason for everything, it kind of gives also an excuse. So, like I said, if the Christians during the Crusades did go and pillage a village and then rape women and everything, they can say, well, these women are evil and this is what they deserve. There's a reason why we're doing this.
There has a reason, yeah.
So
right.
Everything has a reason. If I do this, there's a reason for it. And then it's terrible. We should kill these people because they're evil and God wants us to. So
Yeah.
maybe always have a reason instead of having, well, this is just outright wrong and there is no reason or excuse to do it. But just always well, there's always a reason for something bad.
And then people can take that and use it for their own purposes and justify what they do. Yeah. I think that is a danger of this approach. And every time I go back over this material, I think, gosh, Augustine, don't try so hard, here to find a reason for everything. It involves you in the same sort of endless contradictions and speculations that the philosophers whom he criticized are involved in. you can argue with this forever, and it seems heartless. And I don't think that Augustine intends to be heartless. But when you basically say, either God is making you a victim to prove some sort of point, or God is punishing you for some past sin, which doesn't make sense if these women were Christians and they were forgiven. Or God is trying to just sort of warn people against pride. It seems kind of cold. There's just a few other reasons to remind people that their soul is more important than their body. So this would be a more general response that, why do bad things happen physically? Why do we get diseases? Why do we have accidents? Because it's a constant reminder that we need to focus on the spiritual and not the physical. To test us, that's a frequent answer that a lot of people give. I've heard that in modern times, right? God is testing you, trying to prove your worth, bringing you through this difficult time to show, your faith and so forth. And obviously following that to remind us to strive for heaven, right? That to reject earthly things as not as good as those things of heaven, okay? But still, the world gives us things that we cannot ignore, as he says to the Stoics. And so, I don't know. He tries mightily, but doesn't necessarily come to a resolution that's really comfortable, even to his fellow believing Christians. Okay, that's how hard these questions are. There's a lot of pitfalls that people can fall into. He believes in a providential God. He doesn't believe in a God that sets up a clockwork universe and lets it go on its own, but a God who cares and loves people and who cares about their choices, and actually, more than that, plans. And that is the type of God that many people believe in, the God that plans. You hear people say, this is part of God's plan. And whether it's good or bad, God has a plan for you. Okay? And people believe that they get put together with their mate as part of God's plan, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that's not an unusual belief, but when pushed to its extremes, can become problematic. He also believes that we are ultimately rewarded or punished. Okay, but that the reward and punishment come in the next life, not in this life. Okay, so there wouldn't be a whole lot of point to believing any of this if you didn't think that sin is ultimately punished and humility is ultimately rewarded. Okay. Any other comments about his arguments so far? Got anything else to say? All right. Do you think that the people of his day would have been satisfied with this, given their motivations for asking the question?
I don't know. I feel like at some points it would have driven some people away because, they were newly converting to Christianity, going away from paganism.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like you said, all the way back in the first book, even in the likenesses of sufferings, there remains a mightiness in the sufferers.
Mm-hmm.
So, you just never know who's going to end up suffering.
Yeah,
So
and that doesn't seem too attractive to a new possible convert or a new believer.
Well, I was doing all right when I was worshiping all these other gods.
Uh-huh.
Now that I'm here doing this, it's I'm being punished for it.
Yeah, so there'd be a desire for a God who could, come to your aid, who could give you strength, who could make sure that the battles that you fight you win and that you're protected and so forth. But one thing that Augustine clearly acknowledges here is this isn't the nature of the God that he believes in. Okay? And, the people went back and forth for centuries about this. During the Middle Ages, you see people continue to believe that somehow God is that kind of God who will come to your aid, who will fight your battles. If you fight under his banner, you'll win the battle, and so forth. But at least Augustine is acknowledging here, this is a very different kind of God than that. Okay? That's the difference between the pagan gods and the Christian God. One of the big differences as far as how the God impacts the world is does he fight on your side in a battle? Does he put up a shield when you're about ready to be attacked? And Augustine does acknowledge through his writings here, no, that's not what God is about, apparently. So to that extent, he's not trying to make excuses, but he is trying to figure out, well, given that, so what purpose, what meaning can we get out of these calamities? Okay. Now, there's another issue, and this is what we'll talk about more on Wednesday, that pops up in your readings. He starts writing about the Roman Empire, and really he has a vast, knowledge of the empire, of the emperors, of the exploits of the empire, and he treats it in a way that has at least two different aspects to it. One seems to admire certain aspects of the Roman Empire. Okay, some of what he says sounds rather positive about what the various emperors were able to achieve. But then on the other hand, sometimes the other face is the empire is full of violence, and it's decrepit, and it's corrupt, and it's greedy, and so which is it? Okay? Augustine seems to judge the empire partly on its actual worldly physical success, okay? But on the other hand, he judges it on God's view of human behavior, and he finds it very lacking. So it's kind of interesting that he wouldn't just stick to God's view. He starts to develop this system of the two cities, okay? The city of man and the city of God. Okay? And when he looks at the city of man, he judges it both on worldly measurements and on spiritual measurements. Okay? And he begins to rank different types of leaders and different periods of time in the Roman Empire as far as how good they were, how much praise they could receive. And this whole issue of honor comes into play. From the Christian, totally pure Christian perspective, honor and glory are misleading. They're bad things because they lead you away from God. The more you want honor and glory, the less you care about God. Okay? But they can be good things because they lead worldly people to strive to achieve great things and to get the praise of others. And that can make them better than they would otherwise be. More successful, but also better. Because people only admire those who are better than themselves. Okay, so when we come back, we will get into this whole question of how he views the glory and the honors of the Roman Empire. All right?